Over the past week, tensions between US President Donald Trump and Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell have become increasingly public. Trump has been openly critical of Powell for keeping interest rates elevated, going so far as to post a handwritten note online accusing the Fed chair of costing America a fortune. But in a recent panel discussion in Portugal, Powell offered a subtle yet pointed response, suggesting that recent tariffs introduced by the Trump administration are the key reason the Fed is hesitant to lower rates.
Chair, would the Fed have cut more by now if it weren't for the tariffs?
I think that's right. In effect, we went on hold. The prudent thing to do is to wait and learn more and see what those effects might be. So for now, we're waiting.
So what's the deal here? Why are the leaders of the US government and the Federal Reserve, two institutions that ideally work in harmony, now at odds over economic policy? The first thing to understand is the role that both the government and the Federal Reserve plays. In this context, the US government is responsible for controlling America's money, so collecting tax revenue, deciding how much money to spend and where to spend it, and commonly taking on debt to pay for stuff that they can't afford. Now, the Federal Reserve doesn't do any of that. In fact, the Fed is independent from the US government, and their job is to do two things: try and maintain price stability throughout the economy, i.e. make sure the US dollar stays stable and inflation doesn't cripple the system, and also to promote maximum employment in the process. Now, they do these two things by adjusting interest rates. When the Fed raises interest rates, borrowing becomes more expensive, so this slows down economic activity, mortgage and loan repayments rise, people have less disposable income, and demand across the economy softens, helping bring inflation back down. And conversely, when the Fed lowers interest rates, borrowing becomes cheaper, loan repayments shrink, households and businesses have more money to spend, and economic activity picks up, stimulating growth and job creation. Now, the current situation at the Federal Reserve is this. After the big wave of post-COVID inflation, the Fed raised interest rates from 0 to around 5.5%. This was the highest interest rates had been in decades, and Americans really felt the pinch, but it did work. Inflation cooled from 9% all the way down to 2.5%, where it sits today. Now, with that success, that's prompted the Federal Reserve to begin lowering interest rates, right? You don't need the clamps on as hard because inflation is so much lower. So the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates 3 times in the back half of 2024, down to about 4.5%. But since then, they've stopped. Many people, including Trump, expected the Federal Reserve to continue to lower interest rates to ease the burden of repaying borrowed money. That, however, hasn't happened. And the reason for it, as I briefly mentioned at the top of the video, is because Jerome Powell and the Federal Open Market Committee are concerned that Donald Trump's tariffs are going to spur a second wave of inflation. Tariffs are, after all, inflationary. The idea is that tariffs make imported goods more expensive for American consumers. They do that to encourage consumers to buy American-made goods instead, that are usually more expensive, but higher prices for consumers is like the definition of inflation. So what Jerome and the FOMC have decided to do is just keep interest rates where they are for the time being to try and prepare for any potential resurgence of inflation thanks to the tariff that Donald Trump has imposed earlier this year.
Is July just too soon to seriously even consider a rate cut?
Yeah, I really can't say. It's going to depend on the data, and we are going meeting by meeting. I mentioned how I'm thinking about that, but it's going to depend on how the data evolve.
From the Fed's perspective, this caution makes sense. The US learned a hard lesson in the 1970s about easing policy too quickly, allowing inflation to rebound after appearing under control. With tariffs now adding potential upward pressure on prices, holding interest rates steady is, in their view, a prudent step. However, this has clearly frustrated President Trump. He's repeatedly voiced dissatisfaction with Powell's decision to keep rates elevated, and over the past few months, he's been increasingly vocal in his criticism. In fact, here's a snapshot of some of the comments he's made.
You were criticizing the Federal Reserve Chair before coming to this summit.
Yeah, I think he's terrible.
Do you ever have a guy that's not a smart person and you're dealing with him and you have to deal? He's not a smart guy.
I think he's a very stupid person, actually. Low IQ for what he does.
I guess he's a political guy. I don't know. He's a political guy who's not a smart person, but he's costing the country a fortune.
Anybody would be better than Jay Powell. I think it's Trump derangements in your person.
president's latest demand came in a handwritten letter held up by White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt at a press briefing yesterday. You see her there. Trump penned a message to Powell in Sharpie on a list of world central bank rates, writing in part, quote, "Jerome, you are, as usual, too late. You have cost the USA a fortune."
So why the sharp criticism? Why is President Trump so focused on Jerome Powell's decisions? Well, there are likely two main factors. The first is political. High interest rates are generally unpopular with voters. They lead to more expensive mortgages, higher loan repayments, and less disposable income. And while the Federal Reserve sets rates independently, the public often associates economic discomfort with whoever is in the White House. And that dynamic can affect approval ratings. In fact, Trump's own approval rating after his first 100 days in office was the second lowest of any US president since 1953, trailing only his first term. So that's the first big reason, but by far the bigger reason Trump is getting frustrated is because high interest rates not only make repaying mortgages more expensive, they also make the government's debt more expensive to pay off. And that's a problem when you want to introduce a big, beautiful bill that has been widely criticized for its expected cost that will inevitably be financed by taking on more debt. You see, the US government is in a sticky situation. They've run a deficit for the past 25 years, meaning they spend more than they earn. In other words, the last time the US made money in a year was 25 years ago. And because they spend way more than they earn, whenever they want to do something big, they have to finance it by going further into debt, so by selling bonds. Now, that's where the Fed's interest rates play a role. If interest rates are low, the amount of interest that the US has to pay on a big fat debt pile is pretty minimal. In these environments, you can get away with big spending bills and it won't cost you that much in interest. But eventually, that debt comes due, right? But because the US doesn't make money, it means that when debts come due, they can't pay them back. So what they do is they just roll over the loan. They take on a new loan to pay for the old one. The problem is when they're doing that, they're paying back a loan that had a 1% interest rate with a new loan that today has a 5% interest rate. Now, this is a real problem that's been happening a lot over the past few years. If we look at this chart, we can see that in 2020, the average interest rate across all government debt was 1.8%, but today it's significantly higher at 3.3%. This ultimately causes America's interest expense to rise, as we can see, from $523 billion for the whole of 2020 to $1.13 trillion last year, which means the government has even less money to spend on other stuff like healthcare, the military, social security, etc. Well, you would think that, right? But in reality, they still spend as much on those initiatives, they just let the annual deficit worsen. But it's no secret, this deficit widening has been big in the news over the past few years, and the stories haven't been positive. It's what Elon and Doge were trying to fix. It's one of the reasons that Americans voted Trump in. He stood for tightening government spending and fixing the finances. And that brings us to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, a major legislative proposal that combines substantial tax cuts with proposed spending reductions. However, according to the Congressional Budget Office, the size of the tax cuts significantly outweighs the spending cuts. So as a result, the CBO estimates the bill would add approximately $2.77 trillion to the federal deficit between 2025 and 2034. And given the US government is already running a deficit, any additional shortfall would need to be financed by issuing more debt at a time where interest rates are higher than they've been in decades. You see where I'm going, right? The cost of government borrowing is directly influenced by interest rates, and those rates are set by the Federal Reserve under the leadership of Jerome Powell. If interest rates were lower, it would be less costly for the US to finance new spending or tax cuts like those proposed in Trump's bill. But with rates sitting around 4.5%, the cost of servicing new debt is significantly higher than it has been in recent history. Now that reality puts additional pressure on any plan that increases the deficit. And from a political standpoint, this dynamic has naturally led to growing frustration, particularly from President Trump, who is now directing sharp criticism towards Powell and the Fed over the economic impact of keeping rates elevated. But is this criticism fair? Whose fault is it? Well, this is where things get quite interesting, and we have to go back to the graphic we threw up at the start of the video. What is the US government responsible for, and what is the Federal Reserve responsible for? Now, the Federal Reserve is simply responsible for managing interest rates with two objectives: promote price stability while maintaining maximum employment. That's all they do. That is their dual mandate that Jerome is always referencing. Now, the US government, by contrast, is responsible for fiscal policy. That means it manages how much revenue is raised through taxation, how much is spent, and how budget shortfalls are financed, typically through borrowing. So when Trump accuses Powell of getting political by keeping rates high, it's worth asking, who's really playing politics here? Trump's bill comes with both very popular elements like tax cuts, but it also comes with very unpopular consequences like adding trillions to the deficit. Heck, these consequences even caused Elon Musk to quit his government role in frustration. But Politics 101 is taking credit for the good and shifting blame for the bad, right? So is it Jerome Powell playing politics, or is it Donald Trump? After all, Powell and the Fed are simply doing their job, trying to keep the economy in check and keep prices stable. But in the process, they've become a convenient target. And the crazy thing about all of this is they're taking heat over interest rates that aren't actually that high. If you look to history, interest rates at 4, 5, 6% are actually completely normal. If you're in your 30s or 40s today, ask your parents what the interest rate was on their first home, and their answers might surprise you. They probably bought their first home at interest rates between 10 and 20% back in the 70s and 80s. Our problem today is that we've all become conditioned into thinking that anything above 2% is a high interest rate because of the last 15 to 20 years where interest rates have only rarely drifted above that range. So, as Howard Marks has been saying, it might be worth rethinking what we consider high rates. Ultimately, what we're seeing now isn't a punishment from the Fed, it's just a return to reality. And in that reality, borrowing costs a bit more, deficits matter a bit more, and fiscal choices, like cutting taxes or increasing spending, carry real long-term consequences. But with that said, let me know what you think down in the comments. It's a really interesting situation to discuss. And finally, I will just mention, if you want to come to a 3-day live investing workshop in Atlanta in September with myself and my investing idol, Phil Town, please register now. This is a 3-day investment education of the Warren Buffett strategy that both myself and Phil preach. Spaces are limited to 300. The ticket is free. You just have to find your way there. But if you're interested, please sign up today using the links down in the description and pinned comment. These events don't come around too often, and also if you've signed up but have not yet sent your hotel or flight confirmation to the Rule 1 guys, please remember to do that ASAP. Remember, your place is only locked in once you've done that. But apart from that, guys, that's all I've got. Thanks very much for watching. Leave a like on the video if you did enjoy it, and I'll see you guys in the next one.